Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Peter Lafarne of the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation and our esteemed panel.
Hey.
Oh. Thank you.
Please.
Like musical chairs. Thank you.
Very well done. Good afternoon, everyone. As you know, this is a panel on U.S. leadership and forced displacement. And as said, I'm Peter Lafarne, the CEO of the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, very concerned about refugee and humanitarian issues. A couple of years ago, I would have said that there are 70 million people displaced in the world. We've upped that to 100 million this year, and we're looking in the 21st century at a century of displacement, where the problem is likely to get worse, not only from conflict, but also from climate. And so we need to look for solutions in the future that are greater than the solutions that we've offered in the past. The question today is about U.S. leadership. As you know, the U.S. was instrumental in starting the humanitarian system as we know it today, but that system needs to grow. And our leadership has frankly wobbled over the last decade. So our panel today is going to walk us through what we might do and where the answers might lie. They're very experienced. To my left, we have Ambassador Mark Greene, who is head of the Wilson Center and the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative. Ambassador Greene is a former administrator of USAID and former U.S. ambassador to Tanzania. On his left is Henrietta Fore, also former USAID administrator. We have almost a full house here today, and former executive director of UNICEF. And then on her left is Sherry Weston, the CEO of the Sesame Workshop, which is the nonprofit educational organization behind Sesame Street, and very involved in refugee and humanitarian issues. So, Ambassador Greene, let me start with you. Why is U.S. leadership important, and what should be on our agenda?
First off, thanks, and it's an honor to be with this panel. So let me give you two reasons why it matters. One practical, one aspirational. In a practical sense, the U.S. is far and away the largest bilateral donor of humanitarian assistance. And so the world looks to us for the priorities that are set. Aspirational. The U.S. is a country that is not defined by territory, but a set of values and a set of principles. And so aspirationally, I think it represents who we are. And so when the world looks to us as a force for good and sees that we set this as a priority, that matters. As to what should be on our agenda, it's looking both short-term and long-term. Short-term, there's an immediate humanitarian need. We all recognize it: emergency food, emergency medicine, emergency shelter. But for true compassion, we also have to look beyond. We have to look around the corner. We know that displaced communities are spending a greater and greater portion of their life in displaced settings. And the question becomes, what are we going to do about their future to help tap into all the potential, the capacity that they have, but also to protect them from vulnerability?
Thank you very much. Henrietta, let me ask you, what are the root causes of the situation we're in, and how can those be addressed?
So what Mark is talking about is something that we just don't pay enough attention to. The United States government carries both humanitarian funding, and they also carry development funding. And humanitarian funding is to protect every life and to make sure that food and shelter and water and protection for a UNICEF of children and of their families occurs in times of conflict, of war, of famine. But then you need development. You need the longer-term assistance. And if you don't address that, then you actually are just being palliative. You're not being helpful enough. You're not changing the world. So we have to have a very strong development program if you don't address the root causes. So drought and floods are the largest cause for climate displacement. Human conflicts, the war, the tribal animosities, that becomes an enormous driver of displacement. And we can help to change those things on the ground for the communities so that they get health care, that they get the ability to plant their crops and have irrigation, that they have a school and irrigation, that they have a chance at water and sanitation and protection services. So it's the quality of life of someone who is displaced, and if we don't address it as a root cause, then America and the world will see it as a larger problem. So address it in the beginning.
Very good. Prevention as well as cure.
Exactly.
And Sherry, help us to understand how this is not just a governmental issue, but civil society, business, creativity, the work that you've done.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you, Peter, because it's also philanthropy. Mm-hmm. And you have been an incredible leader with the Hilton Foundation, as have others, MacArthur, Lego, in really investing in those scalable solutions. So I agree with Henrietta, of course, in terms of the need for development. But when you talk about starting at the beginnings, we're still talking about 100 million people displaced, almost half of whom are children. And so I think some of the most powerful interventions that have been made have been focusing on the youngest children affected by crisis. And yet, in spite of that, it's still less than 2% of humanitarian aid goes to those early years. And the reason I believe it's so important is just because we know today, through all of the science and research, that those early years, the first 5 years of life, are the most critical for a child's brain development. We also know through science that when they are exposed to severe stress, to severe trauma, at that critical window, it literally changes their brain architecture with long-term repercussions affecting their cognitive ability, their long-term health, their productivity. So my point really is it's this huge, great irony that the children, young children, who have the most to lose in terms of what they're experiencing during crisis and displacement, also have the most to gain. We know quality ECD interventions can help mitigate that effect to put them on a path for success, and yet they receive the least. So I think examples of the creativity are figuring out what are the programs we can create to give resources to caregivers, to parents, to those who are dealing and helping young children. Because if we don't, talk about the beginning, they're at a total disadvantage. We have to put them on a path forward to thrive, or how can they possibly have the skills they need to help rebuild society?
The importance of investing in the early years.
Early years.
Ambassador Greene, leadership is not just taking forward what we have today and finding the resources to pay the bills for today. We've got a humanitarian system that could be described as a smokestack industry or something that dates from World War II, in any case. What is the U.S. role in helping to imagine the humanitarian system for the 21st century?
Thanks for the question. So let me answer it in a couple of ways. So first off, I think what we have to do is identify that basic toolbox of services that we believe are a prerequisite for human dignity. And so that we can go into displaced settings. We tend to think of camps, of course, most are displaced, scattered displacement, but find ways to make sure that we are addressing child by child each of those services. But secondly, it's American ingenuity. So let me tell you a quick story about the two ladies to my left from my days at USAID. Henrietta was at UNICEF, and there was a large refugee camp that I was visiting, and we were being told by the host country government that we couldn't have schools there because that would imply that these refugees were never going home, which they weren't. But we're looking at this and saying, my God, what do we do to provide assistance to these very young children because of what Sherry described? Well, the lady to my left came up with learning centers, which didn't trip the wire, I guess, of schools, and nobody would suggest they're a replacement for schools, but at least provided services. So how do you do the content? Well, there was Sesame Workshop, who had a world of experience in helping to provide some basic content for young children that could be broadcast and delivered. So we worked around a bureaucratic challenge, not arguing it's sufficient to the task, but arguing it was something that was entrepreneurial and creative. I believe that we have to break through those barriers and apply that ingenuity in much more productive ways. We don't need workarounds. We need to embrace the challenges and the opportunities that are in every human being, whether they're displaced or not.
That's great. And Henrietta, I know that was not your only foray into education for humanitarian issues. Can you tell us something about how you see that?
Very good at being creative in terminology.
Yeah.
So we dreamed about connecting every school to the internet, every school in the world to the internet. I mean, wouldn't that be something that we could do as a world? I mean, there are lower satellites now, and there are little Wi-Fi receptors that you could put on the top of every school, and then every student and every teacher could be connected, and there could be remote learning. And when you think about displaced people and their lives, they usually just run from home when they hear gunshots, and they run into the forest, and they don't go with anything. So they're really without everything, and if you could just bring education to them, it would make an enormous difference. So we began working on the life after 5 years old, for what could a young person learn, and what kinds of skills could they learn. We know that 8 out of 10 young people in the world today, in the developing world, will have to be entrepreneurs. So we need to teach them skills so that they can make their own jobs. They're not going to have our kinds of jobs. So we really focused on how to have remote education, how to have it caught up so that if you're 16 years old and you have not yet been in school, that we could have remedial education and you could catch up. Mm-hmm. But if you get an education, you can carry it with you anywhere. Right. And that's an important message from all of us.
Indeed. Sherry, you're probably, of all those here, closest to the public and public opinion. How can U.S. public opinion be brought toward the leadership question?
That was the one question I told you not to ask.
No, I'm avoiding politics.
Well, listen, I think that what we have to do is we have to prove that we can make a difference. Mm-hmm. So it's so important to also invest in research on mm-hmm. what's most effective for children in crisis settings. You know, people look at some of these, it seems so daunting. 100 million children displaced. You see Ukraine covered on the news, you hear about children who are spending their entire lifetime in displaced or in conflict settings. I think when people see hope, when they see programs that are working, you know, one of the things that we've done in Sesame Workshop, we started our work in the Syrian response region, yep. focusing on displaced children, and it led through generosity of MacArthur Foundation, Lego Foundation, Hilton Foundation. We were able to adapt and to expand to Bangladesh, to expand to East Africa, Latin America, now Ukraine. And we do needs assessment everywhere we go. And what we found is regardless of the geography, what children need who are affected by crisis is the same. But the contexts are so different. So for us to invest in scalable solutions, it needs to be a global response, but local programs, really meeting the needs of that community. We use everything from broadcast to home visits to WhatsApp to chatbots. We have to use so many different ways depending on the context. We're also investing, thanks to philanthropy, $30 million with Global Ties at NYU on what's most effective, and we'll share that with the world. So I think the way you can get public opinion to come with you is to show solutions, show hope, show children thriving. And honestly, if we're not giving children the skills they need, that's something that puts us all at great risk. This is an investment in shared success.
Absolutely. And the overarching narrative being so doom and gloom and dire, I think we have to redouble efforts to get across a message that we know what works, we know how to do it, and it can be done efficiently.
And we're so interconnected.
And Ambassador Greene, I promised Sherry that I wouldn't ask about politics, so let me ask you about politics. What is the U.S. political appetite for taking a leadership role, and what can be done to help that thrive?
Thanks, Peter. To be honest, it's one of the reasons that the Wilson Center is taking the challenge on. As you know, we're congressionally chartered and we are fiercely independent and nonpartisan, and we want to create a safe place to have discussions so we can get at an analysis, objective, clear-eyed, sober-minded about what works. Because it's there. There are lots of things that work, but right now it's getting drowned out by the fierce partisan bickering and debate that goes on. Let me add one thing to this on top of what you've just heard. Sherry was referencing long-term vulnerabilities, why we should be nervous if we fail to do these things. Also think of this. You have all of these children who were either born displaced or growing up displaced, and someday, God willing, the fence comes down, the gate opens up, whatever imagery you want to use, are they going to be connected to the world around them, or are they going to have spent all of these years essentially in isolation? If they're in isolation, I get very worried about the implications for them and, quite frankly, for us. On the other hand, if we use some of the approaches that Henrietta's talking about and some of the tools and content and skills that Sherry's talking about, it's not perfect. None of us should pretend that it is, but we do create a connectivity. There are so many cases in these displaced settings of human beings with fantastic capacities who can really make contributions. The challenges we face globally are significant. If we aren't listening and tapping into all those capacities, shame on us. It's there, and that's why I think we have to do this.
Fantastic. We promised we would get people out on time, so what I would like to do is ask each of you for one parting thought of a minute or so. We have an audience here presumably very interested in U.S. leadership in forced displacement, and yet I imagine also fairly daunted in thinking what their own individual efforts might do. What encouragement, what advice and support do you offer to them in terms of what they, the organizations they work with, and the society around them ought to do? And Henrietta, maybe we can start with you.
So I'll put my vote with looking after those who are displaced, but also with the community around them. Because you want the people to be able to integrate. You want the children to be able to go to school together. You want there to be prosperity for all. So collaboration with the local community.
All right. Sherry?
Well, it won't surprise you that I would say that I think we have to take a leadership role in prioritizing and investing in early childhood. And the other point I would want to make is when we invest in those critical early years, it's also an investment in all the SDGs to put children on a path where they have the ability to thrive. And I will say, Henrietta will love this, but I was talking to a Ukrainian educator who I met several weeks ago, and I thought she put it better than I possibly could, but she said, war takes away everything. The only thing it doesn't take away is education. And so we have to invest in that which can't be taken away.
Thanks. Mark, take us home.
Well, I would argue, in addition to what you've just heard, it's making sure that we recognize the scale and the scope of the challenge. So there's a real risk. We tend to have our attention drawn to whatever's on the television at night. Right now, we look at the terrible problems that are facing the Ukrainian people, but we can't forget the Venezuelan crisis. We can't forget the Nicaraguan crisis. We can't forget the Syrian crisis. We don't have that luxury. The truth of the matter is this is a global problem, and it requires all of us to be very clear about what it is that we see and what the possibilities are, and we can't let this slip away. I think Sherry pointed to it early on. There's the positive, all kinds of capacity in these young people, but there is the other side, the darker side. If we fail to do this, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we will wonder what happened, and we will look back on these days as an incredible, wasted opportunity.
I think what you have all said really is we have an opportunity here, and we also have a responsibility that we need to rise to. And we've done it before. When you look at the system that was set up after World War II, it has served well over the last 70 years. But it is time, I think, for us all to be thinking what can accommodate the larger problems of the world today. So thank you very much for your thoughts today, and good luck in your important work.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you,
again.
Peter.
Okay.